Say goodbye to the 24-200 and say hello to the Nikon Z28-400. What's up, y'all? It's Project Photography back with another video, and today, this right here is the Nikon Z28-400mm f4-8 VR. And man, this is an absolutely mind-blowing lens. I've done 2 shoots with it so far. One was here at this very park, and another was in San Francisco. I took a trip there, and I shot a lot with this lens. So today, I want to give you guys my first impression of this lens, but we first have to start off with the focal length, because that's easily the best part of this lens. And I mainly use it with my Nikon Z30, and as you guys know, it has an APS-C size sensor in it. And paired with the 20-400, this actually turns it into an effective focal length of 42-600mm. Now, 600mm is absolutely insane, and I think that's a major reason why I love using this lens so much. Now, 600mm is just an absolutely crazy focal length, and it's not one that I'm going to all the time, but it is really nice to have it in the back of your pocket when you want to use it to capture really far away subject matters. And there's a few aspects that I really like about 600mm in particular. First of all, being able to choose whatever subject matter you want and being able to capture it, literally any subject matter, it's just absolutely nuts to me. I mean, there are subject matters that I didn't even think were possible to grab that I was able to get because we have 600mm. One thing to kind of note about 600mm though is that it is very difficult to get sharp images, especially if there's a lot of atmospheric conditions. Because you're going to be zooming in so much more, the distance between you and your main subject matter is just going to be so much farther than your average focal length, for example, like a 14mm. And these past couple of shoots, I have been going to 600mm on purpose, but a lot of the times, I found myself that I don't really need to have to go to 600mm. I just found it's really unnecessary, and it's just so much more difficult to grab a consistent composition. And something I found is kind of interesting is that if you're not going to be able to grab the composition with 600mm, then you're not going to be able to capture it with any other lens, at least in a reasonable form factor. Like, I'm not going to be going out and getting an 800mm lens just to shoot this maybe one niche image consistently. I mean, it just doesn't make sense. And that's why I kind of feel like 20-400 on an APS-C size body is the perfect focal length to use. Something else that I kind of want to note is that you really shouldn't be going to 600mm all the time. It is super difficult to get consistent compositions, again, with a tripod in particular. Zooming in to 600mm, and then when I put the camera on the tripod and tighten it, it will move quite a bit from that tightening point. And that's really difficult because you have to really adjust for it. For me, I found myself aiming a little bit higher than I wanted to with 600mm and kind of letting the camera fall to the exact composition I want. Now, that's a lot easier said than done, but I think that's an adjustment you have to make, especially when you're going to be using it with a tripod. And of course, with an extreme focal length like 600mm, dust will be much more present, and it's going to be a lot more severe in particular. And I think you just have to be wary of that and make sure you have a clean sensor, which is why you got to clean your sensor. If your sensor is dirty, it's going to be really hard to use this lens, but it's not really an issue. That's something you can definitely clean up in post. Now, I've talked a lot about the 600mm component of this, but the reality is this is a 28-400. So with a Z30, being able to go from 42mm all the way to 600 gives you so much breadth, so much range, and especially paired with something like a Nikon Z6 and a 14-30, you're really going to be able to cover a lot of those bases extremely well. And something I found is kind of cool is that when I was using my 24-200, again with a Z30, it would be a 36-300. Now that's fine. The issue is though, I found it to be too much of an overlap relative to having also a 14-30. And I personally think that this is a benefit of the 20-400. 42mm to 30mm, that is quite a ways away. And so you're forcing yourself to really go to that 14-30 when you need it. A lot of the times with the 24-200 with the Z30, I find myself getting kind of lazy and just saying, I can capture it with the 24-200. Don't really need to go out and change lenses, even if, you know, the composition might be better with a 14-30. And a huge reason I'm a big fan of something like the 20-400 over something like a 100-400 is, again, that wide angle flexibility. Let's just say you're using the 100-400 on a Z30, you would get a 150-600. Now that's a great focal length, but the issue is we're going to be losing that 42-150mm. That is a really large focal length. And honestly, I feel like for me, I'm going to be using that focal range way more often than, let's just say, 200mm and up. And I really feel like that's where this lens doesn't compromise on the wide angle side of things. Now, I've talked a lot about the 28-400mm on the Z30, but what about with a full frame camera like the Nikon Z6? Well, to me, I think this is really interesting because 400mm is still going to be plenty long for tons of landscape photography. And of course, with a full frame sensor, we're going to get better dynamic range, better image quality overall. And I don't know if you're really going to miss having that extra 200mm on the long end. It just depends on what your personal preferences are, if you want to go with a full frame versus an APS-C size sensor. But one thing that's really nice about having the full frame sensor is at 28mm on the wide angle side. And I think this is especially nice for when you're doing just a one lens shoot, where you're out in the city or you're traveling, but you don't want to bring a ton of different lenses and you just want to bring one. I feel like the 20-400mm with a full frame sensor is more than ideal. And honestly, I prefer that over just having the one lens with a Z30 and the 20-400. Plus, if you're using this handheld, having the viewfinder, especially at those really long focal lengths, is such a major advantage. I mean, it's borderline impossible to get really sharp, clean compositions with a crop sensor, but especially because the Z30 does not have a viewfinder. But for me personally, I really like using the APS-C size sensor when I also have a wide angle lens. But again, if it's just one camera, definitely going to be using the Z6. But focal length is not everything when it comes to this lens. Actually, who am I kidding? The focal length is the most important part of this lens, but it does feel like overkill to a degree. I mean, this lens on an APS-C size body is just absolutely ridiculous. I mean, 600mm, like, when are you really going to be using 600mm? When I had my 24-200, I was mainly shooting between, let's just be real, 36mm all the way to around 180-200mm. So 600mm is really, really long, and I really don't know how practical that is for a lot of photographers. You're going to be very happy using the 20-400 on a full frame sensor. 400mm is going to be more than long enough, and if you're using an APS-C size body, maybe the 50-250 would be a better lens, or the 24-200. Those are both fantastic lenses and will absolutely get the job done for landscape photography. You really need to know what you're doing with this lens, because I think it's really easy to become really overwhelmed with just how many different focal length options you have at your disposal. It's like going out on a shoot and bringing 8 lenses with you, and then you have this like sense of paralysis because, oh, I don't know what lens to use. That's exactly almost how I feel with using this lens. You have to know how to use it. And for me, I think a key point when crafting compositions with this lens is that you have to know what composition you want and how you're going to shoot it before you even touch your camera. Because when you're crafting those compositions, you can't just go and say, okay, let's just zoom in and see what happens and just hope for the best. With this lens, you have to know what you're doing and you have to craft those compositions in your head before touching the camera. And I think especially if you're starting out, being more limited in your options allows you to just clear your headspace and just focus on taking the landscapes. But if you do know what you're doing, I mean, this lens is just a straight up beast. Of course, having those different focal lengths may be overwhelming at times, but I mean, being able to literally grab any composition you want without fail is just mind-blowing. I mean, that's so powerful, and especially in such a small form factor like this 20-400 is, I literally cannot think of a better telephoto lens for landscape photography. I can guarantee you, you will not miss another telephoto composition ever again with this lens. And I think that's just so incredible and solves so many of the issues that I had with the 24-200 in particular. Sometimes I felt like 300mm in terms of its effective focal length with an APS-C size sensor just wouldn't capture some shots that I needed. Some things were just a little bit out of reach and I couldn't grab that perfect composition. With the 20-400, that is not a worry at all. We're gonna be able to grab insanely clean compositions every single time. There's so much that I want to test about this lens. I mean, I only really talked about the focal length in this video because if I'm being real, that's the one thing that stood out to me is the focal length. No other lens can do what this lens does in a small form factor like it. But there's things I want to test, like aperture in particular. I want to find out more about the build quality and how it works ergonomically with my bag in particular. And I think those are huge questions to ask, especially when it comes to the performance of this lens. And I'm really excited to continue to test it. I want to get a few more shoots in. I want to say maybe like 4 to 5 more shoots. If I can do that, that'd be really good. So it is going to be a little while until I'm able to make a full flesh out review, but I promise you when I do make that review, it might be one of the best reviews I ever make because I think this lens just has so much to offer. It's so unique and so special when it comes to telephoto lenses. So yeah guys, that's pretty much it for this video. If you have any questions about this lens, please feel free to leave it in the comment section down below. I would love to answer them and maybe even include them in my full review, because there are still a lot of questions that I want answered. Definitely going to be answering them in my full review. So thank you so much for experiencing the world with me today. Please feel free to rate, comment, subscribe, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.